Hello. Hello and welcome to the Friends of Panthertown webinar presentation featuring Dr. Patrick McMillan. He is the Hilliard Professor of Environmental Sustainability at Clemson University and the Director of the South Carolina Botanical Garden. Friends of Panthertown is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that protects and maintains Panthertown Valley. It's a treasured 6,300-acre backcountry recreation area located in Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina. The mission of Friends of Panthertown is to work in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service to conserve this outstanding natural resource while improving the quality and experience of recreational opportunities in Panthertown Valley. We're a member and volunteer-supported organization, and our hardworking volunteers maintain the 30-mile backcountry Panthertown Valley trail system. Our members and partners support much-needed conservation projects with donations and grants. And we have a special guest here this evening that's going to help us to introduce Patrick. We have Dr. Dan Patillo, one of the co-founders of Friends of Panthertown, and Panthertown Valley has benefited greatly from Dan's advocacy. Dan is a retired professor of biology who taught plant science and ecology at Western Carolina University for 4 decades, from 1966 to 2004. Dan served as the editor of the Chinkapin newsletter for the Southern Appalachian Botanical Society from 1993 to 2012, and directed the Western Carolina University Herbarium from 1970 until his retirement in 2005. Dan is a member of Friends of Panthertown and a strong supporter of the work that we do. Dan, would you take it away, please?
Hello, friends. Panthertown is one of the places that I'll never forget since I've been there since 1970. But today, what is really great for us is for you to meet a friend who I'm sure you've met before if you watched the South Carolina Educational Television Expeditions with Patrick McMillan. At least this is how I think you would know him. You may not know that he has won an Emmy Award for that program, and so he's well known in these parts. He is a naturalist educator for over 20 years with the Glenn and Hilliard Professor, Environmental Susceptibility Professor. He is a faculty member at the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation, and he's the director of the South Carolina Botanical Garden, the Bob Campbell Geology Museum, and the Experimental Forest at Clemson. His youth started, unlike most children who get immersed in Dr. Seuss, Patrick's grandmother read to him common and Latin names from the animal kingdom and wildflower books, so his brain is soaked with these kind of names and have served him well all these years for his expeditions wherever he has been. His dad and grandfather spent some time with him in the wetlands of Florida, especially the Big Cypress Swamp. The family then moved to Allegheny County, North Carolina in 1976, where he continued his interest in wetland bogs, and I hope he tells us something about that. I think I first met Patrick, and he reminded me of this, the kind of memory he has. And this was for March the 12th in 2002 at the Wataco Mountain when I was invited to come down and meet with him for a field trip. And he has followed us with many of my mystery plant challenges of Chinkapin. So for that, Patrick, take it away, man.
All right, thank you so much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to remind you as we go through our webinar today that there is a question and answer section right down at the bottom of your screen. You should see Q&A. So if you have a question for us today, please just ask us the question. Dan and Jason both will be helping to field those questions, and hopefully when we get done today, we'll have time to answer all of the pertinent questions that come up. Certainly glad to be here with you today. I am speaking to you from the very place Dan was talking about. I still have a home in Allegheny County, and my family and I just got back up here. And believe it or not, we just got out of a bog. So we've been right out in this habitat that we're going to speak about today, just in the last hour or so. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to try to get this to share with you so we can begin today's presentation. Let's see. All right. So hopefully we can all see that. So today's topic is Southern Appalachian bogs and fens. And you'll notice it doesn't just say bogs, it says bogs and fens. And that's part of what I really want to talk to you about today, is that there is no such thing as just a bog that repeats itself across the landscape from one site to the other. Every single one of these Southern Appalachian wetlands are absolutely unique, and they're really not equivalent to what we traditionally term bogs a little farther north. I have had the opportunity over my lifetime to really see some amazing places. I've been from pole to pole. I've been, from deserts to rainforests to Svalbard to the rainforests of southern Chile. Just some absolutely amazing and outstanding places on planet Earth. And I've been very fortunate to see all these. But my heart always comes back to the same place. And I think that's the case for many of us who grew up in Appalachia, is that our heart really rests in the rocks and the valleys, and for me in the bogs here in these mountains. And so Allegheny County is home, and I just managed to move back 2 years ago. We live here part-time, and we live in Clemson part-time. And it's just been an amazing experience after having been really absent from our neck of the world for 25, 30 years, to be able to come back and reacquaint myself with some of these really beautiful and intensely colorful and lively places that we call bogs. So what does a plant need to grow? To understand a bog, we have to understand really, we need to be understanding what conditions create the bog. And we're going to be talking about natural communities today. And I use this term a little different than a lot of other people, because to me, natural includes human activities. But if you think about all the things that a plant needs to grow, all the things that an animal needs to survive in a certain area, those things in your mind, you might think about light. They need water, different levels for different species, for different habitats, those abiotic factors, right? They need minerals, they need soil, but they also need space. They need to be able to compete. They need, perhaps in case of almost every plant, a fungal associate, mycorrhizae. And each one of these elements within these habitats are interacting with each other, so that the heather and the cotton grass that I've got shown here, which is a picture I actually took in southwestern Ireland, in a bog that over there they would call a heath. All of these conditions have to come together to really create the conditions favorable to a bog. So a natural community, in my definition, the definition that I use in my class and the definition I came up with, is an interactive assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. It's a little different than the other definition you'll see down below by a North Carolina biologist, because I tend to really look at the processes and the interaction when I look at any space, whether that is a community that's existing like this one up in Doughton Park on the Blue Ridge Parkway, a lovely tall grass prairie remnant, or whether I'm looking at a garden space that I'm designing at the South Carolina Botanical Garden, or for a friend or for a client. I take into account everything. I try to really look at the interactions that are going on there, because every space is unique. And when we talk about a habitat, we're like a bog. We're really talking about something that we as humans are placing a label around, and every single one of them can be markedly different. So from a general term, what is a bog? A bog is one of those places that you just kind of know when you see it. It's different from a marsh. It's different from a swamp. We think of swamp systems as being forested environments. We think of marshes as not being forested, but there's a huge difference between a bog and a marsh. A pitcher plant's not going to grow in a marsh. Pitcher plant like this one is going to grow in a bog. It's going to grow associated with sphagnum. There's going to be an interaction there with the environment, all the biotic and abiotic interactions that create a bog, which is so different from a marsh. So generally speaking, bogs are places with peat. They have these highly organic, highly acidic soils that are humic. They're composed mostly of partially decomposed dead organisms. And in the case of most of our boreal or temperate bogs, those that occur outside of the tropical areas and outside of the humid and hot southeastern coastal plain, the one organism that's contributing the most to that is the moss that here you can see this beautiful round leaf sundew immersed in. Sphagnum moss. It has an amazing capacity to hold water. Sphagnum can hold many times its weight in water. And that ability to hold and store water is a lot of the magic that builds bogs. Bogs and marshes, completely different systems, because marshes are what we call eutrophic systems. They have a lot of nutrients. They usually have flooding and charges of nutrients, and they usually have a mucky mineral soil. And bogs are peat. So I'm going to try to show you a little diagram that will illustrate what happens in a true bog. A true bog is what we call an ambitrophic wetland, okay? Ambitrophic means that all of the water and all of the nutrients, or at least the vast majority of them, are coming from the atmosphere. They're being deposited by rain. And they're usually being deposited in a scooped out section of the landscape, just like you're seeing here, where really, in most cases, glaciers in the past have scooped out big divots into the landscape. So bogs, in the true sense, tend to occur in places that 18,000 years ago looked much like this picture of the Silverthrone Glacier up in British Columbia, but they would have been in places like New York, Maine, Vermont, Southern Canada, and Great Lakes states, places that had the impact recently, as early as or as late as 12,500 years ago, of having glaciers sweep through the area. So for those of you who might be familiar with glaciated terrain, and those of you who aren't, this is a photograph of one of the places that has some of the highest bog concentrations in North America. This is Mount Katahdin area in Maine, sort of central northern Maine. And you can see the typical glacial landscape of having these mountains that have been sliced and carved flat by glaciers, and huge broad valleys that are often scoured. These scours, once the glaciers left, started to be filled. And because they were starting from rocky surfaces, they didn't have a lot of nutrients available for that system. And they were really just ponding water. And that ponded water started to fill in with all of the different types of vegetation that can tolerate those really highly acidic conditions. And so we have a couple different types of true bogs that we recognize up north. This is one of them. This is often called a muskeg, or a blanket bog. It has two of my favorite ecological terms, flarks and strings. Flarks and strings are those swales that you see down in the bottom left, and the highland in between them, which really isn't that high. These are usually long, elongated channels that tend to fill with peat and develop these linear high ground of peat that rises just above the water level, and super highly acidic water that occupies the low areas in between. Another type of true bog that we see in the north is the kettle hole bog. And this is one of my favorite places to go tromp around in, because these are lakes. And when we think about the glaciated north, you think about Minnesota, you think about Maine, they're dotted with thousands of little tiny lakes. And this one that I've got an aerial photograph in here from Google showing you is near Millinocket, Maine. And it's one of my favorite because you can take people right into it. It's right off the side of the road at the Big Moose Inn. And all of this pink material that's all around this lake is predominantly two species of sphagnum, Sphagnum warnsdorfii and Sphagnum bartlettianum, mosses. And they're forming a big, giant, acidic floating mat so that when you walk across this bog, you quake. Well, they start out as open lakes like this, and this is a nearby site that it's really a kettle hole, but it has a much smaller fringe of a bog on the outside. And shallower sites, this is the site I just showed you the aerial of, have these really amazing thick floating mats of vegetation. Well, these highly acidic habitats are home to things that if you're familiar with Southern Appalachian bogs, you're going to look at and you're going to say, hey, I know what that is, or at least I know close to what that is, because it looks like the things that we have in our Southern Appalachian wetlands here. So we have pitcher plants in those main bogs. There, it's the northern purple pitcher plant. Here, it's the mountain purple pitcher plant. We have, 5 or 6 species of cotton grass in the bogs up in Maine and the Northeast, and even more if you go to the muskegs of Alaska. It's one of the genera that gets more speciose as you go farther north. But instead of vaginatum, this wonderful species here, we have tawny cotton grass here in the south. You'll see things that look like mountain laurels. And if you're a real bog savvy person here in the southeast, you might be familiar with something that looks just like these two bog laurels that we call Carolina wiki or Carolina sheep laurel or sheepkill. This is a much smaller species than our common mountain laurel, but it's closely related. It's in the same genus, the genus Kalmia. Has those spring-loaded stamens, which you can see right in the center there. These stamens are held back in the sort of crown-like projections that extend all along the edge of the corolla tube, and they're held outward under tension so that when they're visited by a bumblebee or carpenter bee, they trip that anther and it ends up spraying pollen all over the back of the pollinator. And you can even see that and play with that on the mountain laurels around Panthertown in May and June when the mountain laurels are blooming. There's cranberry in these bogs. And if you think about probably the one plant we associate with bogs up north, it's probably cranberry. But we also have cranberry in South Carolina, the same species, Vaccinium macrocarpon. And this picture was taken about 3 miles from where I currently am, a place called Sparta Bog. And they form cranberries, and gosh, at my son's farm, we even have enough cranberry plants growing naturally that every year we pick a bowl of cranberries and make our own cranberry salad for Thanksgiving right out of our own bog. So a lot of connectivity in things between what's going on up north and here in the south. So generally, bogs are places with peat, right? And we have these places that have deep peat in our mountains. Is it any wonder that we've called these places bogs? They look like northern bogs. A lot of the species are the same as we see in northern bogs, but these places aren't truly bogs. They have sphagnum, in many cases the same species as sphagnum, but these systems are fens. And to truly call them by the name that they should be called, we really need to refer to them as a oligotrophic poor fen. A poor fen is one that receives its water primarily from springs, from groundwater, and water that seeps into this wetland system contains minerals and nutrients that it's picked up from the bedrock and it's picked up from the soil around the bog and carried into the bog proper. So even though these soils are extremely acidic still in many cases, they're not truly ambitrophic. They are what we call oligotrophic. So regardless of that, almost every named bog in North Carolina, almost every named fen in North Carolina has the name bog. So the one I'm showing you a picture of here is one of the smallest, but to me, the most photogenic, one called Lone Pine Bog here in Allegheny County. So once again, I'm going to try to show you exactly what I just talked about in this little illustration here. So instead of catching all of your, or most of your nutrients and water from the atmosphere, a fen is where we have rain washing down through the soil, reaching bedrock or another impervious surface like hard clay, and then seeping out along the edge or at the base of the slope to form a small wetland that is really supplied by water that has been enriched, at least slightly, by its interaction with soil and with bedrock. And those are properly termed fens. So we call these Southern Appalachian poor fens if we're talking about them in a technical term. And there are two types of our typical Southern Appalachian poor fen in North Carolina. Again, I want to tell you, every one is unique. No two have the same species. No two have the same dominant species. You'll go to one fen site that has bog turtles, and you go to another fen site that's only a mile away, looks almost the same, doesn't have bog turtles. This one is one of the largest fen complexes we have in the northern part of South Carolina. This is the Sparta Bog site, which was purchased as a mitigation site by DOT back in the late 1990s. This is what we call a northern subtype when we're talking about the two types of fens that we have in North Carolina. This is an example of a southern subtype. This one used to be much more open, but you can see right away some differences. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner of this picture, you'll see this big clump of pitcher plants. We don't have pitcher plants in the northern bogs. The pitcher plants occur south of the Asheville Basin, and that's really the dividing line for the northern and the southern subtypes of these two fens. The northern subtype is found north of Asheville. The southern subtype predominantly south of Asheville. Northern subtypes, we have cranberries, naturally. Southern subtypes, well, we have pitcher plants, naturally, including one that's found only in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia called the mountain purple pitcher plant. Really cool variety of purple pitcher plant, which is on its way right now through some research that's being done to being elevated to probably a whole new species, probably soon to be called Sarracenia montana instead of Sarracenia purpurea variety montana. The northern bogs have unique species too. Many of the species we see in our northern subtype bogs can also be found in some other habitats. Gray's lily. Even though we think about Gray's lily, that beautiful species on the left, as being found most characteristically in what we call mountain balds, those sort of grassy tops to places like Roan Mountain, where the photograph in the bottom left is taken. They're actually more abundant, and there are many more sites for Gray's lily in the valley bottoms in our Southern Appalachian mountain fens of the northern subtype. The picture on the right is a 5 to 6 foot tall giant featherbell that is found in our northern subtype bogs. And believe it or not, I just substituted this picture because my wife and I were just in this bog, and I just took this picture for a book that I'm just throwing the last pictures in that's being published on A Guide to the Wildflowers of our region. Southern bogs tend to have more large populations of the endemic species. And one of the rarest is this one, which is only found in our southern subtype mountain bogs. This is the famous mountain sweet pitcher plant, known only from a handful of locations in Transylvania, Henderson, Buncombe formerly at least, and Greenville and Pickens counties. So just a little crescent of southwestern North Carolina and northwestern South Carolina. Very typical of the subset. Well, if you go just a little south of Panthertown, to the very edge of the mountains, you enter an ecoregion that is now recognized by the Nature Conservancy and others that I've spent most of my career at Clemson working in, called the Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment. And this region is truly one of the most unique crucibles of life in the eastern United States. This is a strange place because it is where the mountains begin, but it's also where the mountains are closest to both the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. And as the weather patterns pass through this area, they rise up against this very odd thing that our mountains do. The Southern Appalachian Mountains run from north-northeast to south-southwest, right down to about Chimney Rock State Park, Hickory Nut Gorge, and then they do something really weird south of there. Around Tryon, they move more east-west than they do north-south. And when you get over into Raven County, Georgia, they start that trek back down to the south instead of being east-west. Well, what this incredible rise, this escarpment from the Piedmont up into the mountains does because of this is it captures moisture in the wintertime, and it has the same moisture that most of the region has in the summertime, mostly caused by convective storms rather than the jet stream. And these mountains are the rainiest place east of Washington State in the United States. And so we experienced some of that in Panthertown because it lies within this region of high rainfall. But when you get down to places like Gorges State Park, which is right just south of center in that map, Gorges State Park 2 years ago had 134 inches of rainfall recorded. By far the highest rainfalls consistently in Eastern North America. All that water means that water is plentiful. It's cut deep gorges and it runs over surfaces that in the rest of the escarpment, we really don't have water running over as much. It makes our region the waterfall capital of Eastern United States. And when it runs over rock consistently, we get tiny little ribbon-like wetlands that form along the edge of these watercourses over the rock that are open to sunlight, similar to our open mountain bogs, and they're consistently moist because it rains enough to keep the water flowing over this rock constantly. These are called cataract fens. And even though they're some of the smallest wetlands that we have in the eastern United States, they harbor some of the rarest species. Then we have another form of cataract fen that has a higher dose of minerals and pH in it than typical cataract fen. We call this a mafic cataract fen. They're really high in magnesium, and there's only one example of this on planet Earth, and you're looking at the entire habitat. All that we know exists on the entire planet right here. And here we find bizarre things that shouldn't be there. The rock type that the water flows through will greatly influence the chemistry of the water that comes out of the springs that leads to the fens, whether we're talking about cataract fens or whether we're talking about fens in Ashe County or Jackson County, North Carolina. And that fen that I just showed you, that mafic cataract fen, we call it mafic because referring to the magnesium in the rock. And this type of rock, amphibolite, is where the spring gets its start up on top of Pinnacle Mountain where this fen is located. And that water carries the magnesium and the calcium from this rock down over the lower granite and transport those minerals so that we have, instead of common bog sedges, we have Biltmore sedge as the predominant grassy component in this bog. And this is a very rare species that is special in Panthertown. In Panthertown, we find it growing on moist rock outcrops. But in our neck of the woods, down in Greenville County, or Pickens County, South Carolina, we find it growing on the edges of cataract fens. But anywhere you see this plant growing is a good sign that there's a lot of magnesium in the soil. So mafic cataract fens. Lilies here too, but a different lily than the graze lily that we see in our northern subtype bogs. Here on the edge of these cataract fens, we find Canada lily, which you can also find throughout Western North Carolina here and there, very similar to the graze lily. It's a red colored lily, and that tells us who are ecologists a little bit about it. Those red flowers held way out there away from leaves and dangling downwards are really there to attract hummingbirds. So it's one of several species of reddish colored lilies that supports hummingbirds. Again, There's wonderful relationships that occur in our flora. Also in these mafic sites, we find things that we don't typically find in open mountain bogs. So we have 2 species of Grassa parnassus in the Southern Appalachians. They're some of my favorite wildflowers because if you look at them up close, that incredible green stenciling on those petals it's unbelievable. And they flower along with gentians at the very tail end of the growing season. So only a few asters, gentians, and Grassa parnassus are in bloom at the end of October, mid to end of October in our area when these things are blooming. And in acidic soils, we find kidney leaf Grassa parnassus. And in those enriched soils in our mountain fens that have richer soil and these mafic cataract fens, we find this much rarer species, the big leaf Grassa parnassus. Well, there is one true rich fen found in North Carolina, and it's found in a place in Ashe County that's owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy. And you can get the opportunity to go there, but you pretty much have to go to this site on a field trip that's offered by the Nature Conservancy because access is limited into this site because of its fragile nature. On top of Bluff Mountain, we have a flat space. And it's just one of the strangest things in North Carolina. You get to the very top of this big, tall mountain in northwestern North Carolina, and there's this giant flat open area. It's very grassy. There's no trees in it. And it's very shallow soiled, right over top of rocks. And the species that grow here are some the same as we find in those areas that we would have traditionally called bogs, those areas with much lower nutrient content than we see in a true fen. But there's not much sphagnum here, and there's virtually no peat. It's almost like it's caught between the world of a marsh and the world of a bog. So you can see from the ancient pathway through the middle of the fen, lots of that amphibolite, that mafic rock right at the surface in this rocky, shallow soiled and rich soiled fen. So here we find some species that you can see elsewhere, in many cases in North Carolina, but some of them are found in virtually any bog, like the Melanthus virginicum on the left, the Virginia bunchflower. And some are restricted to fens and seepages that come out of rocks. And one form of seepage like that is pretty close to Panthertown. So the Balsam Mountains along the Blue Ridge Parkway near Devil's Courthouse have all these wonderful seeps that come straight out of the rock that was blasted to create the Blue Ridge Parkway. And these seeps have richer substrate than we would find in a typical fen. So you can find things like northern bog asphodel in Ashe County, and then again down in the Balsam Mountains. Some things we don't see very often elsewhere in these wetland communities in North Carolina. Things like the Virginia mountain mint on the left are almost restricted to rich soil fens, and Indian paintbrush, which we're used to seeing on just wooded sort of forest margin roadsides, appear right in the heart of the fen in places like Bluff Mountain. And lots of other cool things that only a plant geek like me would be interested in. So we're not talking about just one type of habitat. We're talking about a myriad, and every single one of these little mountain wetlands you go to is different. This is a habitat that's only found in about 400 square feet in northwestern North Carolina called the prairie slough grass swale. And it's really a type of fen, of poor fen. And it's very close to where I am, but it's so different from all the other types that we've ever sampled in the Southern Appalachians that it exists as its own little habitat, its own natural association of interactions, its own natural community. And it's also the place where I find the most floriferous forms of Turk's cap lily. Most of us know this plant. It's one of the most beloved July and August flowering wildflowers in the Southern Appalachians. But few of us may have noticed that there are two different color forms, two different growth forms of this plant. One that's much more red, that grows in open mountain bogs, fens, and stream sides, old meadows, and another that is much paler that grows in the forested habitat. We believe this is just an adaptation to the lower light levels and the different response to the different habitat. But it is amazing to see these things in a mountain bog with these sort of brilliant reddish flowers. And in the case of some of the bogs, plants that might have 50 or 60 flowers on a single flowering stem. It's spectacular. Well, one of the groups of plants that I want to talk a little bit about, because they are typical of our fen habitats in the mountains of North Carolina, are the orchids. So I want to take a moment just to appreciate the orchids that we have. Some of these, which you can find in Panthertown, all of these, which you can still find at least one location for in the mountains of North Carolina. And we're going to sort of look at them throughout the year. Bog rose, this one is probably the rarest of our orchids in North Carolina today in our mountains, at least the ones that are still extant. Bog rose ranges as a common plant in the northeastern United States through southern Canada. But here in the south, it's limited to these open mountain fens. Used to be hundreds of them in the little bog only a few miles away from me here in Allegheny County. And today it's extinct at every site except one in Transylvania County, North Carolina. Potentially extinct. It could be out there lurking around, but just such amazing, dainty little orchid. And it illustrates the point of just how fragile these ecosystems are and how dynamic they are. They change. And they're already one of the most threatened ecosystems that we have, or one of the most threatened habitats that we have in the Southern Appalachians. Originally, we think there were about 5,000 acres of mountain bog in North Carolina. Today, there's less than 700 acres remaining. And you can imagine, you can think about how massive the Appalachian region of North Carolina is. Over 20% of the rare species of plants and animals known from our area are found in bogs, but they occupy only a tiny fraction of 1% of the overall landscape. So even though they're so uncommon, they're incredibly precious because they harbor so much of the life that is rare and unique to our area. As the season progresses from April and early May when bog rose blooms, one of them are more common orchids, which I always looked at in my grandmother's wildflower book and thought, oh, I can't wait to see this plant. And I didn't realize it was growing only a few feet from my back door. Finally, when I saw this plant for the first time, I realized it's a little bit smaller than I thought it was. These flowers are usually less than an inch long. So even though they look like a cattleya or like a vanilla orchid flower, and they're related to vanilla orchids actually, these flowers are tiny. But to see a whole host of them across an open grassy fen is truly a remarkable sight. If you bend down to look at those tiny inch-long flowers, you'll be shocked and amazed. Another species much more commonly seen in our mountain bogs and much more widely distributed are grass pink orchids. We have a single species in the mountains, Calopogon tuberosus. There are 4 others on the coastal plain. But this species quite a bit larger and more robust than the 2 that we just looked at. And it looks like an orchid kind of, but not wholly in our mind is that registering as an orchid. I want you to look at that. Look at the white variant on the right and notice all the little yellow tufts of hair on that upper petal. That upper petal is actually the lip on this orchid. And we can do something to a grass pink orchid to make it look a little bit more like an orchid flower. We can turn it upside down. Grass pinks have flowers that are what we call non-resupinate. Most of our orchids have the lip on the bottom, but they have the lip on the bottom of the flower because they actually twist their flowers upside down before they open. Grass pink doesn't do that. And the reason grass pink doesn't do that is because this lip is hinged at the base and it fits down almost perfectly on top to that little spoon-shaped projection you see called a column at the bottom of that flower. The tip of the column is where the pollen is housed, and just below the tip is where the sticky stigmatic surface. The female section is found. And this flower these flowers have these yellowish hairs to trick pollinators into visiting the flower, thinking they're going to get a meal of pollen. And when a bumblebee or a carpenter bee lands on that petal, it's heavy enough that it causes the petal to fall backward onto the pollinia, onto the sticky masses of pollen at the tip of the column. The next flower it hits, that hammer and anvil function will come down, and lo and behold, you effect cross-pollination by taking the pollinia from the back and transferring it to that sticky surface. Many of our orchid flowers are pollinated by deceit. They trick the pollinator into visiting them. Others, like the one you see pictured in the top left there, the monkey face orchid, the white flowered orchid up there, have these long tubes. Those tubes have nectar. Nectar is a reward for the pollinator. Most of our orchids don't offer that reward. Most of our orchids trick them because the reward, producing nectar or producing a pollen that's rich in fat or protein, is expensive for the plant to make. And remember, bogs are usually very nutrient poor, and you have to work to make a living. You don't want to waste that precious energy or time if you don't have to. So as we move through the season, you can really see some of the incredible beauty up until this time of year when we have the Panthertown ciliaris with those nectar spurs blooming on roadsides and mountain bogs, ragged fringed orchids. And some of these orchids have now disappeared from the Carolinas. This one today is extant. It means it still exists in Tennessee and Georgia. But the last time that this orchid was seen in the Carolinas was when this picture was taken in the year 2000, in preparation for the wildflowers of South Carolina. And since that time, no one's seen this plant extant in the Carolinas. But we are finding new things. Sometimes we find plants in our mountain bogs that have distributions that are predominantly down in the coast. So incredible variety of life, and just so many different forms of even just orchids. Not all orchids look the same. Two of the more unusual, notice the one on the left is called Liparis locellii. The fen orchid, like slightly higher nutrients than most orchids. It grows in fens, not true bogs. Well, bogs, as they progress, in the absence of disturbance, start to grow into forests. And this is a process that you can see happening in Panthertown, and you can see the end product here where my wife is tromping through right near our home here in Roaring Gap, and what we call skunk cabbage bogs. And these, even though we call them a bog, they're no longer a bog. These are small stream swamp forest complexes. Remember, bogs are open like a marsh, and a swamp is a treed, a forested community. Very different. Skunk cabbage is present in both the open and the closed canopy systems, and is a cool plant in its own right. I mean, this thing produces flowers in February that melt the snow with an exothermic reaction as it releases butyric acid out of those spathes to attract pollinators like flies to come in and trick them into visiting their warmed flowers. These skunk cabbage bogs are not entirely unnatural. I mean, this is the natural progression for open spaces, is to eventually become forested. And we can see that in some of the bogs that have become forested. This is a pitch pine. I think it's currently the state champion pitch pine at one of these closed canopy systems. This pine was cored, it's over 340 years old. So this has been a system that has existed for a long time. It's not open. It's the terminal end of what happens to our open bogs, but it has unique species of its own. Things like Coptis trifoliata, which are only found in these systems here in North Carolina. Robin runaway, which is only found in these systems. And the federally threatened swamp pink, which many of you have probably gone to view up at the pink beds in Transylvania County along in the Pisgah Forest region. That is a closed canopy, small stream swamp forest. So unique species exist in both systems. Unique species exist in Panthertown. And I want to share with you some of the really cool plants that are in the Panthertown bog. This is Chelone cuthbertii. There are four species, excuse me, of turtle heads in our mountains. And this one is by far the rarest. And it's one that occurs in the bog at Panthertown and one that is disappearing quickly from many of our locations in North Carolina. So you need to treat this as a precious plant. I love these plants. They're related to snapdragons. They're in the plantain family. And if you look at the flowers closely, you can see why they're called turtle heads. Those little flowers look like a little turtle's head. And if you squeeze the sides, you can get them to talk like a turtle, open and close their mouth. A spectacular plant, limited to such places. A very odd plant called the climbing fern is found in Panthertown's bog. This is a fern which grows an indeterminate frond. So what looks like a vine on this plant is actually a single frond of the fern that continues to expand at the tip, not a stem. And it's one of the most unique ferns in North Carolina, one that is common in bogs, but also sometimes we see it on really exposed sort of moist clay road banks. We even have a very ancient plant called Pennsylvania ground pine. Dendrolycopodium hickey, one of the unique and rare species found in Panthertown's bog. It's much more bristly than the common ground pine that you're probably used to seeing in forests. And the photograph on the left, you can see the common ground pine all the way on the edge of the picture with the oppressed little leaf-like phyllodes, and the plant on the right being Pennsylvania ground pine with those bristly stems. Remarkable, and a plant that normally occurs far to the north. So those are our Southern Appalachian fens and some of the tiny bit of the unique life that makes a living there. But our fens present us with, for those of us in the conservation community, what I think is the greatest challenge in the Southeast towards preserving their unique biodiversity. We are trying like a Dickens to preserve these sites, but we don't truly understand them in a broad context. And I don't think we understand them well enough to keep them around. These open Southern Appalachian fens have been kept open since European colonists displaced and, the genocide that happened to Native Americans. Since Europeans took over this landscape, they've managed it with bush hogging and with grazing. And we have another habitat that is sort of mysterious like this in the Southern Appalachians called the mountain balds. So we had grassy habitats that were grazed and bush hogged down at the bottom. We had grassy habitats all the way up at the peaks of the mountains that were grazed with livestock called mountain balds. And the fact that we utilize them through grazing has given a lot of pause to many in the conservation community in calling them natural. The prevailing theory for how these open places came to be is that they were initially opened by megafauna. So things like elephants, elk, giant grazing and browsing animals that during the Pleistocene, during the ice ages, would have grazed in the bottoms and grazed at the tops of our mountains and moved back and forth the same way we see today in places like Yellowstone and Rocky Mountain National Park. If you think about those places, they're grassy on top, they're grassy in the park systems, the bottoms. And that wasn't a man-made phenomenon. That was started by mega herbivores. Well, once we lost the elephants in the east, once the end of the ice age came, we still had bison and we still had elk in our mountains. And they were probably doing the same thing as the mega herbivores of the Pleistocene. Once they were killed off, the European descended colonists were putting their own stock animals into the same rotation pattern. And that system went on for a long time. Today, that same bog, that same picture that you see here, the next photograph I'm going to show you is looking back at where I took this picture. I took this picture we were looking at here in 2007. I took this picture looking back into the place where I was standing in 2018. This is about all that's left of this 26 acre open mountain bog today. And this is a site that we quote unquote preserved. It was purchased. It was set aside as a protected wetland. The wetland hasn't been damaged. But what stopped was the traditional management. The traditional grazing, the bush hogging, has allowed a lot of these woody vegetation to invade. And that woody vegetation that has now invaded the bog, this is what the center of that shot looks like in this day and age. It's covered with alder. It's different. We're losing these open sites. It's one of the biggest threats to these open habitats is woody invasion by native plants. We have the problem here, especially in northwestern North Carolina, of having deer and no natural predator. We're not controlling the deer population enough in our area to keep them from not having a huge impact. And we've lost populations of things like the bog jack in the pulpit. We've lost probably half of them in my county because Bambi has decided to chew them off. Invasive species have come from elsewhere, like this microstegium grass, the basket grass, that I just took this photograph about 2 hours ago in one of these skunk cabbage systems, these swamp forest complexes that is just completely overrun with this invasive exotic, completely changing the dynamics of what happens in late summer and fall and pushing out species like that incredible Cuthbert's turtlehead from this site. So we have a big question to answer when it comes to bogs in the conservation community. How do we manage them? We have this philosophy that was largely pushed down to us by people like John Muir that nature exists as wilderness in the absence of man. And then we have the reality that is an absurd concept, that on this continent, human beings have managed these systems for eons. The Native Americans for maybe 20,000 years prior to the Europeans. And today we're not doing the same traditional management on these lands, which means that in places like Panthertown, which is one of the goals of the Friends of Panthertown, is to really ensure that these precious places that preserve so much of what makes the Southern Appalachians unique is actually managed in a way to meet a management goal, to see places that are so special, like our little mountain bogs, preserved. And that bog in Panthertown was cored. I learned from my dear friend just a little while ago, just yesterday, Dan Patillo, told me that the cores taken from the bog at Panthertown show that this site has been a bog-like system, a poor fen, for 15,000 years. Incredible. So, things like bog turtles tell us about the management. Bog turtles do best when we have grazers. And who would want to live in a world without bog turtles? I mean, look how cute they are. My friend Mike Knorr taking most of those photographs. There are no bog turtles in Panthertown, but life abounds there. And each one of these sites is unique. So, bogs to me have always been the center of my biological world and the place where I go to see abundant life. So please continue to support organizations like the Friends of Panthertown. If you're not a member, if you don't contribute to what they do, please join me in doing that, because the preservation of all these sites, not just the bogs, but this incredible valley, this incredible landscape, is vitally important to our future. So I will say some thanks and leave the rest of our time, whatever I've left of it, to some questions. So let me get off of the screen share. And Jason, let's see what we got for questions.
Patrick, thank you. I know we're going to get some questions in right now. I would like to share that the Carolina Wetlands Association this year selected the Panthertown Valley Bog as one of their 2020 Wetland Treasures of the Carolinas. And you can take a virtual tour of the Panthertown Valley Bog on our website at panthertown.org/bog. And right at the bottom there, you can also watch an episode of Patrick's Emmy Award-winning PBS television show featuring the mountain bogs, A Threatened Heritage, which was season 4, episode 8. I don't know how many seasons you're into it now, Patrick, but
we did 13 on-air seasons. We were 15 years doing the show, and I retired it last year.
Wow,
so
tremendous. Well, that episode is still available to watch. You can watch it on our website. You can see the tour, the virtual tour of the Panthertown Bog. And certainly we appreciate everyone logging in tonight to watch the webinar, the presentation. We'll have this available as a recording that you can watch later on our website. And we would very much like to thank two very special members of Friends of Panthertown who have sponsored this webinar tonight, and that's Marcia and Steve Schaller. And they are great supporters of Friends of Panthertown. Marcia serves as one of our board of trustees, and we thank especially Dan Patillo and Patrick for joining us tonight. We do have a few questions coming in. Patrick, would you like to go ahead and take care of those?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One of the questions is it said, can you show the bog jack in the pulpit again? It went by too fast. Yeah, I always try to put too much into our time that we're allotted, but let me see if I can share the screen and just give you some information about that, because that is a super cool species. So this is the bog jack in the pulpit is Erythema stewardsoniana or stewardsonii. It is remarkably different from the common jack in the pulpit, and it's a good example of my profession, plant taxonomy. We try to make everybody's life as miserable as possible by moving around species names and creating new species names for things that we see in the habitat. The bog jack in the pulpit used to be considered part of the variation of the common jack in the pulpit, and today, instead of one species of jack in the pulpit in our mountains, we have 4. This one has these extremely fluted spades. So you can see the part that covers the jack, the pulpit to the little spadix in the center of the jack is really heavily fluted and ribbed. It's green. Always green, and it's one of the rare plants that's limited to our closed canopy systems. And I think there is a population of that. Probably the closest population to Panthertown would be at the pink beds, where you should just be able to see it right from the boardwalk. So let me stop the share of that. Yeah, you're welcome. So how do you get close enough to see the details of the bog without damaging it? Is a question from Forrest. These bog systems should not be tread into unless there's a really good reason. So for instance, the Friends of Panthertown right now, one of their main projects that they were telling me, that Jason was sharing with me, that they want to see happen at the bog, is the development of a boardwalk leading you to the edge of the bog, which is a safe way to get into these systems. There are a number of these bog systems that have trails developed around them or through them. So the pink beds is a good example. It takes you right by where you can see swamp pink up in the Pisgah National Forest, up on Highway 276 headed towards the Parkway. But many of them are so fragile that if you walk through them, you can actually change the drainage pattern, and you might change the drainage pattern enough to wipe out a whole species of orchid in one of these bogs. So they're places that I always tell people are the best to view with binoculars. So if your feet start to sink, you've probably gone too far. But if you're used to picking out birds with binoculars like I am, then using a pair of binoculars to peer closer into the bog is always a good idea. There are places, where I think we need to bring people into bogs with boardwalks, and I think Panthertown would be a wonderful opportunity to do that, get people into that system without damaging it. Have another question from Grant Campbell. It says, how should the pine forest near the Panthertown bog be managed? And I might also refer this to Jason and Dan, because it's been a long time since I got to Panthertown. I had planned to get to Panthertown before doing this talk, but the world got in the way. So I missed my opportunity through no fault of any person. But in general, these bog systems, some of the biggest threats are the encroachment of woody plants. So, particularly maples, alder, viburnum, start the process of succession in these bogs. And the pines usually are okay. The one problem you can have with pine systems is they can get big. And when they get truly tall and sort of cage in the bog, they can change the light dynamics in the bog. So in each one of these systems, my philosophy is we have a management strategy and we have a goal. So if your goal is to protect bog featherbells, well, you can't have a shade in. If your goal is to protect bog turtles, we need to keep it grassy. If your goal is to protect bogjack in the pulpit, it doesn't need to be open. So in each case, it'll change. The bog at Panthertown is open in the center, right? So some of these species like the Cuthbert's turtlehead depend on that. So that's would be what I think would be a management goal. Did you guys want to say anything else about the forest?
One comment on the pines. The pines were actually planted in there, and they're not doing too well. And really, rock pines that don't belong in a fen anyway.
Yeah. Good. Glad to see him not doing well. Everybody thinks I'm a tree hugger. I actually like grassland communities, so I spend a lot of time figuring out how to get rid of trees in some of these systems. There's another.
We are working with the U.S. Forest Service to work towards improving the bog system that we have now. And I know that the bog is being encroached a bit by some of the pine trees that are on the side of the forest. The Forest Service is doing a bog restoration project currently where they're working to girdle some of those trees or remove some of those trees on the edge and leave them there for the wildlife, but to restore the bog to its natural condition.
Mm-hmm. And an interesting thing is natural condition includes the management by people. And there was a question that just popped up a minute ago about fire. Does fire ever intrude into our bog systems? And it's an interesting one. And, early on in my career, we had a student who studied this at the university there in Chapel Hill, looking for evidence of fire in our mountain balds and our mountain bogs, because it seems like, well, in the coastal plain and in other places, fire maintains them as open. And we have, some species like pitch pine in some of our bogs that have serotinous cones that are opened with fire. We don't have a good record in most of the bogs that we've looked at of frequently returning fire. So just like our mountain balds, we're in a pretty wet area, and even though fires can intrude into there, and then there are certainly exceptions. There are bogs in North Carolina where fire does intrude, but in general, we think of these places as being probably created and maintained through an interaction with grazing, browsing, and human pressure to remove woody plants, as well as the fine textured soils and poor soils, which is another one of these questions. Very poor acidic soils that retard the rapid growth of woody plants.
Let me give you a little bit of a question. There is some charcoal in Highlands bog area, and that charcoal is from surrounding forests. Mm-hmm. And when a fire is burning in a forest, it picks up embers and bits and flaming pieces that can blow into a bog during the fire, and so you get an accumulation. But the thing about that particular study that the Delacourts did, they found, they found that the more distant fires were not very common in that region. And so they were using particle size as an estimation of fire. And fires were infrequent. In other words, it's kind of like, you remember we had in 2016, we had that tremendous period of fire. At that time, those particles would have been dropping into those wetlands and being deposited.
Right. And yeah, those fires certainly didn't stop at the bog, but we also know, and we have historical accounts even from people like Mark Catesby on how frequently the Native American land management made use of fire. So certainly, there are areas where humans were utilizing fire where bogs occur, particularly in South Carolina. And as you got higher up in the mountains, like the Delacourts study is a good one, looking at where fires would have carried on the landscape and where they would have been prevalent. And, the habitats are so different today than they were in 1723 when Mark Catesby came marching through the Piedmont, that they'd hardly be recognized by him. But yeah, so infrequent, I would think, would be the answer to the fire in the higher mountains, and probably frequent in places like South Carolina.
Patrick, we have time for one more question from one of our last participants, if you'd like to read that.
Okay. Well, Gary, yep. So question is it true that the fens in this area have bog-like vegetation due to the more acidic pH levels that are common to bogs? My understanding is that due to the lack of aquifers in this area, as we're on top of bedrock, so the groundwater is more acidic and it doesn't remain as groundwater long before reaching the fens. Is this accurate? That's accurate. Most of our poor fens are in the same situation, where throughout our Appalachian region, we have very shallow, poorly developed soils. So water hits the rock, flows through and seeps out into these mountain wetlands. And in general, they are highly acidic, but they're not albatrophic. So we find more nutrients here than we would, say, in the Kettlehole Bog up in Millinocket, Maine, which is why they really are technically better termed poor fens.
Patrick, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Dan Patillo for being here to answer the questions that folks had. I know we'll have lots more questions coming in through email later, which is just fine. People can send an email to friends@panthertown.org. We'll be happy to pass questions down to Dan and to Patrick. We really do appreciate all of our members and supporters that have come online and been involved in the process of we're conserving this special place. We do, over the next few years, have plans to work on that bog boardwalk. It's a long-term project. We hope that you'll all support us when we do have that, so we can have some interpretive hikes coming into Panthertown Valley. And again, we'd like to thank each of our presenters tonight, Dan and Patrick. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
My pleasure, and it was an honor to have Dan here.
And for all of us here at Friends of Panthertown, we'd like to say thank you so much, and join us again next time when we have another webinar with a fascinating speaker in the future. Go on our website. You can download our current Friends of Panthertown newsletter. You can see all the latest information about what we're doing, and we're going to keep on working for your benefit to make sure that Panthertown Valley is protected and maintained. Thank you all, and have a good evening.
Thanks so much.